Well, thank you for the discussion, or sorry, the introduction, and thank you all for attending the session. Today I want to share with you two studies we ran at Maastricht University assessing both acute and subacute effects of psilocybin on creativity, empathy, and satisfaction with life. But before I get into the studies, or even the psychedelics, I would like to start with creativity. And with this, I would actually like to ask you a few questions. So I'm going to show you pictures of a few people, and I'd like you to raise your hand if you consider them creative. All right? So Jimi Hendrix. Yeah, I see some very eager people, yeah. Yeah? Okay, and what about Aldous Huxley? You may know him? Yeah, okay, you know him. Steve Jobs from Apple? Yeah. And what about yourselves? Who considers themselves creative? Okay, still a lot of hands. Very good. Well, usually when people think of highly creative individuals, they think of musicians, artists, etc. But we as humans are an extremely creative species, and thus we all exhibit certain levels of this skill. So why is this important? So I was recently walking around Madrid, and I came across this picture, and I thought it summed it up very nicely. If you don't see it, it says create or die. You might think that's a bit dramatic. I would disagree with you, and hopefully that's clear why in a second. But before I go into that, I just want to define what I mean when I say creativity. Okay? So creativity is this multi-component construct consisting of flexible, can you see? Yeah. Flexible divergent thinking and rigid convergent thinking. So when you're faced with a problem, you utilize divergent thinking to explore these possibilities, come up with as many solutions as you can to fix this problem. And then convergent thinking, you go through all these solutions and you pick the logical best answer, right? So through this process, we are able to adapt to our ever-changing environment. So that includes finding ways to become more efficient, to finding ways to feed a growing population, and the less dramatic example of just finding a way how to get home when your car is broken down. So this is a very important skill. We use it daily, and people oftentimes don't realize this. It's also the prerequisite for another important skill, namely empathy. So empathy also consists of two parts. Cognitive empathy, which is recognizing or understanding what another person is feeling, and emotional empathy, which is being able to feel what another person is feeling. So it makes sense that you need to be able to think flexibly in order to be empathetic. You need to be able to consider multiple perspectives. And empathy is very important for us. So it promotes pro-social behavior in families and communities. And the ability to recognize what another person is feeling can also make our own personal lives a bit more successful as well. So just to start off, I hope I've clarified what I mean to you, or what I mean when I say creativity and empathy, and emphasize how important these skills are in our daily lives as individuals, but also in a society. Then comes the dilemma. So there are individuals that display deficits in these processes. So individuals with depression, anxiety, and PTSD are characterized by very rigid automatic thought patterns which can facilitate habitual behaviors. So I wanted to give an example to make it more concrete. This is an extremely simplified example, but just to give you an idea, if you would imagine somebody, let's say with depression, who is characterized by an inability to derive pleasure from their environment, they may think that the world is a dull, empty place. Thus they experience pervasively low mood, perhaps are pessimistic about the future, and then they cut off social contact and remain in bed. And you can imagine this becomes a cycle, and if you can't change these thoughts, it would continue, it would be ongoing. Similarly, these individuals display social difficulties and empathic deficits that actually correlate with depression with symptom severity. So the more of a decrease in empathy, the more severe symptoms people experience. Thus, it's rational to hypothesize that perhaps by finding a way to enhance such processes, you might be able to provide symptomatic relief for these individuals. And that's where psychedelics may come in. So there's a large number of anecdotal reports from individuals like Jimi Hendrix, Aldous Huxley, Steve Jobs, so I picked them for a reason, that claim enhanced creative capacity after psychedelic use. Additionally, you can go on Arrowhead and look at trip reports and find tons of people saying that they experience enhanced empathy while under the influence. There are also naturalistic and experimental studies which have demonstrated enhanced creativity and empathy after a single dose of ayahuasca, LSD, psilocybin in the neurotypical population. But there are some knowledge gaps here. So it has not been shown in a placebo-controlled study with a psychedelic what the effects actually are on creativity. And in regards to empathy, if it is enhanced, we don't know how long this lasts. And that is important if you want to consider the therapeutic utility for this, which I'll discuss later. Furthermore, I think everybody is familiar with the studies that have been coming out suggesting that psilocybin in particular can provide symptomatic relief for individuals with depression. Thus, we were interested if psychedelics enhance creativity, if they enhance empathy, does this have a relationship with enhanced feelings of well-being? So to do this, we performed 2 studies. The first of which was a naturalistic study. So this was in collaboration with the Psychedelic Society UK. They hold truffle, so similar to magic mushrooms, experience weekends in the Netherlands, and they kindly allowed us to join and ask people if they wanted to participate in our study. So this included asking people if they would fill out our measurements the evening before they took the truffles, the morning after they took the truffles, and 7 days later we contacted them again to perform the measurements for last time. Now this was an observational study. We did not intervene in any way. We did not give the drug. Thus we don't know exactly how much they took. We tried to circumvent this by asking people how much they took and then getting a sample of the truffles and taking them back to the lab and analyzing them. And with that we get an average psilocin, so the metabolite psilocybin, dose of 27.1 milligrams per person. So arguably quite high. We then performed an experimental study. So this is where we did bring people to the lab. We gave them psilocybin or placebo, and we had them perform these tests while they were under the influence. So we had 60 people come, 30 of them received psilocybin, about 12 milligrams, so moderate dose, and also placebo. And in both of these studies, they all perform the same tests. So I want to explain these tests to you because I think it's very important that you understand what I mean when I say we tested these constructs. So as I said, creativity consists of convergent and divergent thinking. Most tests of creativity only look at divergent thinking. That's because it's been suggested to be a better predictor of creative thought in daily life. But we know this is a process, so we really wanted to look at both of these. Thus we use something called the picture concept test. So in this we show groups of pictures to people and we ask them to make associations between the pictures. So the first, the convergent thinking, is the logical answer. So for example here, the logical answer would be the dog and the cat. They either get it correct or not. Then we ask them to come up with as many alternatives as possible. So perhaps they then can combine the cat and the cup because the cat drinks milk out of the cup, something like this. And they write down why they thought of this so we can go back and analyze it later. So they saw many groups of pictures, they were timed on this, and then we score them on various outcome measures. So as I said, for convergent thinking, it's just whether they got the logical answer correct or not. But for divergent thinking, we can see how many alternative solutions they came up with. We can see how original they were, so how unique they were compared to everybody else. So if I said cat and cup because the cat drinks out of the cup, and you said the same thing, the originality score would be less because we both said it. And then the ratio, so trying to control for the originality versus influency, so you're more likely to have a higher originality score if you give more answers. For empathy, we use the multifaceted empathy test. So this is also nice in that it allows us to separate these two constructs of empathy, to look at cognitive, which is recognizing what another person is feeling. So simply asking them, how is this person feeling? And they pick the adjective that best describes it. And they do this for both negative and positive emotions. And then emotional empathy can be broken down even yet again to how much you feel for that person. So how much, for example, concern do you feel for that person? And how much does it make you feel? So how aroused does this picture make you feel? So again, physiological arousal though, of course. And they go through and rate these. And finally, satisfaction with life, which is a very short questionnaire. You indicate how strongly you agree with a statement. For example, in most ways, my life is close to ideal. So these are 3 measurements. So what did we find? So I'll start with a naturalistic study. This one is published if you want to look into it further. And just to remind you, this is where we went to the ceremonies where people were taking truffles. We had them perform the measurements before any drug, the morning after a drug, and 7 days later. And we see, in regards to divergent thinking, people are able to come up with more creative answers, and they are more original in their answers. Set the morning after versus baseline. We don't see any effect 7 days later. The effect we see 7 days later is convergent thinking. So they give more correct answers 7 days after the drug. The ratio, I'm sorry, it's super small, but it's the same. As for empathy, we don't see any effect on cognitive empathy. So they were neither better nor worse at recognizing emotions. But we do see effects in emotional empathy. So in explicit emotional empathy, on average, they rated higher the morning after. And when you break it down into valence of emotions, it's particularly for negative pictures and nothing long term. Now with implicit, again, higher the morning after for both positive and negative, but this increase in implicit emotional empathy persists 7 days after the drug as well. In satisfaction with life, we see morning after, 7 days after, they are saying that they have a higher satisfaction in life. And I also said we're interested in the relationship between these. So for this, we wanted to look at change scores of the variables. So it's simply taking the morning after score minus the baseline, the follow-up score minus the baseline, and performing correlations to see if a relationship comes up. We did not see any relationship between creativity and empathy, or between creativity and satisfaction with life. But we did see relationships between empathy and satisfaction with life. So the more or the higher their change in implicit emotional empathy to positive pictures, the higher they rated their satisfaction with life, both the morning after and 7 days after, and the higher an increase in explicit emotional empathy, the higher they rated their satisfaction with life 7 days later. As for the experimental study, so this is where we brought people to the lab, we gave them psilocybin, we compared it to placebo. We actually see a decrease in divergent thinking. So they were less fluent, they gave less responses, and they were less original compared to the placebo group. Additionally, the convergent thinking was decreased as well. They had less correct answers. And again, I apologize, ratio is super small, but there was no difference there. As for cognitive empathy, they were less able to recognize the emotional state of others, especially for positive emotions, but they rated being more empathic towards these positive emotions as well, so more concern and more arousal. And satisfaction with life, very small difference, but it is significant. They rated a higher satisfaction with life at the end of the testing day. And again, looking at the correlations, nothing between creativity, empathy, nothing between creativity and life satisfaction. But we find this association trending not significant between implicit emotional arousal and satisfaction with life, which is in line with what we're also finding in the naturalistic study. This was significant, but we did have a higher, more of a change in the naturalistic study than we did in this. And it also makes sense. I mean, the top score in this is 30, and people are on like 27 already. There's only so much you can change after that. So I know we all like integration here, so I want to try to integrate it. I say try because these studies are not directly comparable, right? We have different doses of a drug taken in different settings. We have people there for different reasons. We know this has an effect on the psychedelic experience, but I still think there's utility in trying to get a bigger picture of these effects. So we do see a time and construct-related differentiation of effects of psilocybin on creativity. So acutely, individuals show decrements in both constructs. Whereas the morning after, we see this return of convergent thinking, it goes back to baseline, whereas divergent thinking is increased. And 7 days later, we see divergent thinking goes back to baseline and convergent thinking is increased. So how can this be useful? So again, coming back to this extremely simplified example, but just to make it more concrete, where we have the individual that thinks the world is terrible, feels terrible, thus doesn't want to interact with the world. If you could change this thought process, as I said, perhaps you could alter the cycle. So if they were enhanced and divergent thinking, perhaps they could go back to relive these life events, recall the associations they have, modify them, maybe make new associations, gain a new perspective on what happened, and perhaps this changes the thoughts, right? So with this perspective now, this perspective change, maybe the world isn't as terrible. This may elevate mood just a little bit, they might regain some optimism, and they can get out of bed. Now with this subsequent increase in convergent thinking, that can be utilized later on to go back to this and develop a concrete coping strategy to deal with these emotions and this perspective change, to help them stay out of bed or maybe even go farther and rekindle their social life. And ultimately, maybe they would feel better from this. Now, as I said, there was no relationship that we found between well-being and creativity, but I still think the implications are there. So it might not be that enhancing creativity directly affects how somebody is feeling, but this could open up a window of opportunity where therapeutic interventions could prove more effective. So if you think of this as like a timeline, right? If you want to utilize this, we see acutely, not the time, but the morning after, you could discuss these new associations, new perspectives, and then 7 days later, you could come back and you could develop a concrete plan. If we do the same thing with empathy, we see acutely, we see a decrease. I put a question mark here because other studies have shown either no effect or they've shown a decrease in negative emotions. We see it in positive, so I think the jury is kind of out on that. But in regards to emotional empathy, this is quite consistent. So we see an increase acutely. We see that this persists the morning after, and in regards to at least implicit emotional empathy, this persists 7 days later. So this is also interesting in a therapeutic context. We know the therapeutic alliance between patient and therapist is very important. If somebody is feeling enhanced empathy towards somebody else, perhaps they're more likely to open up, talk about their issues, more trustworthy. So you could utilize it like this. We also find this correlation between empathy and well-being changes. It is interesting to speculate how this relationship occurs. So a previous study from Zurich found that psilocybin enhanced response bias towards positive emotions. So it could be people feel more empathy towards these positive faces because they are in fact paying more attention to them. We cannot assess this, of course, in our study. But it's interesting because this response bias is a proposed mechanism of antidepressant effects. So it could be interesting in further studies to look at the effect of psilocybin on empathy, on this response bias in a clinical population. And talking about more work that needs to be done. So this experimental study, the results I showed to you are an extremely small part of a very big study. We were interested in these cognitive processes, but we were very interested, and I am very interested in the underlying mechanisms of these. So how do changes in these come about? So for this, we did do brain imaging, so we will be looking at connectivity changes, but we were more focused on how psilocybin affected glutamate in certain areas of the brain. I don't have time to go into it, but there's some evidence from rodent models and hypotheses that psychedelics have downstream effects on glutamate. This may be enhanced, and this may underlie some of the subjective and longer-term effects. And in this study, we are finding region-dependent changes in glutamate that do correlate with the acute subjective state and some of our behavioral effects. So I don't have time now, but if anybody wants to talk to me afterwards, I'm very excited to speak about it. But then we're also interested in hormones, so cortisol, oxytocin, immune system functioning, and markers of neuronal plasticity. So basically with this study, we're really trying to get a bigger picture of what was going on. But that is for another conference. So with that, I'd like to thank you for your attention, thank everybody who's involved, and if there's time, I can take questions.